Boom. Yes.
My name is Jeanette Sanger, and I'm a trustee of this wonderful library, and I'd like to welcome all of you for this very special evening with Russell Shorto, speaking about his terrific book, Revolution Song. And before I begin, may I ask you all to silence your cell phones? Thank you. And we appreciate everyone who has donated to the library, and we hope that you will keep donating, because it helps us do wonderful programs like this and add to our collections and do family activities and many other things. And copies of Revolution Song are available outside after the program. And Russell Shorto is the author of many books. He's very distinguished and honored in many different ways. He's written for numerous publications, and his books have been translated into 14 languages. He appeared previously in this room as the winner of the New York City Book Awards in 2004 for his wonderful book on Dutch New York, The Island at the Center of the World. He spoke on that book the following year in our lecture series, and I am forever grateful to the Dutch for introducing one of my favorite words, cookie, to me. Mr. Shorto's imaginative recreation of the Revolutionary era and the founding of the American nation is told through 6 voices. It's as though you're in the middle of the most fascinating novel, or you're reading War and Peace, and you're all these different lives. I cannot put it down. My poor husband is getting no attention. And so he will be extremely happy when I finish this. And George Washington is the focal point, and this is so appropriate for us, as we used to be the Library of Congress, and all the founding fathers borrowed books from here. George Washington, however, was not an ideal library member. He didn't return a book he borrowed. Only recently did his estate return a book similar to the one he had borrowed. And we didn't charge interest, but we should have. I find Russell Shorto's writing so lyrical, particularly in describing the fascinating origin stories of the Senecas. It was fascinating to learn so many interesting facts, such as what violence, killing, and torture meant to them. I loved reading about Margaret Moncrief and her scandalous memoir. Our digitized charging ledger showed that our early members were very interested and read this scandalous memoir as well. The Wall Street Journal has called Mr. Shorto's work first-rate intellectual history. And it's been praised as literary alchemy by the Chicago Tribune and astonishing by the New York Times. Please join me in welcoming Russell Shorto.
Got to get my point. Thank you, Jeanette, for your lovely introduction, and thank you, Sarah Holiday, for arranging all of this. Thank you, New York Society Library, for hosting this and for being here all these years. I think 1754 is when it was founded, which is right in the middle of the lives of the 6 people who I write about in my book. And thank you all very much for coming. I write narrative history, and I suppose I had the idea for this book sometime after I wrote The Island at the Center of the World. That book is set in the 1600s, and really my expertise is in the era of the 1600s in the intellectual world of the Dutch Enlightenment, and of the Dutch Enlightenment in the 1600s is what spawned the wider European Enlightenment of the 1700s. And so in a sense, and this is what appealed to me, because the American Revolution never really grabbed me, I guess when I studied it in high school. But coming at it from the other side, from the 1600s, you saw this period when, starting in the 1620s and the 1630s, people began looking into microscopes and telescopes and realizing that knowledge didn't come from received wisdom from the church or the king, but was in your brain. It had to do with this thing called reason and how it interacted with the world. And so you had Descartes, who is called the father of modern philosophy, because he tried to pull all of this together and say that, as he said, the mind in its good sense is the basis for all knowledge. And very quickly on the heels of that, people started to think, well, if that's the case, then that means that every human being is equally valuable. And if that's the case, it means every person, that the only form of government that is legitimate is one in which everyone has equal say in power. And as far back as the 1640s, people started to say, well, that means that girls have just as much right to education as boys. And in the 1600s, you had people having these idealistic notions to found utopian communities in which you had one man, one vote. So all of that was building. I saw, through my work, my earlier work, I saw this kind of wave of focus on the individual rights, individual freedom, building through the 1600s and through the 1700s. And from that perspective, I was just upstairs before this, I was being interviewed by a Dutch journalist, and because the book was just out there, and I said to him that, because I figured his readers would like to hear that the Dutch they started this big movement, of which the American Revolution really is just a part. That what the American leaders, what they hit on was the idea that you could take this band of the spectrum, political freedom, and another important band, economic freedom, and focus that on their cause, and that's what they did. But what was really going on was something much broader than that. And so this idea I had was, what if you could write a book about the American Revolution, about that era, that took different people's lives from very different backgrounds? Because of course we're used to, even though thousands of books have been written about the American Revolution, which my editor reminded me of. What if you, most of those are focused on the men in the powdered wigs, on the elite. What if you wove together stories of people from different backgrounds? And historians, scholars have for years created wonderful bodies of literature about the role of women in that era, about slavery, about the division between the different economic levels of society. But I write narrative history, and that means storytelling to me, basically, set in a particular time and place. And what I wanted to do was tell these stories of this different group of people from birth to death, and weave them together. And I wanted them, but I wanted it to be one story. So I spent a number of years in the background kind of working on this because I didn't know that it would work. And to be honest, I still don't know if it works. Because I didn't want to force connections, but I wanted there to be enough connection that it reads as one piece, as one narrative, rather than as the discrete stories. So, but over time, and I kind of auditioned people for roles in the book, and there were probably a couple hundred people who I considered in one way or another. And slowly, these people sort of fell into place, and I got to the point where I realized, I think this works. I think it can be told as one story. And that's in essence what I tried to do. And as I say, they had to, I wanted enough interactions between them that they fit together. I wanted them to be from different backgrounds. They had to be people whose lives are well documented in one sense or another. I write nonfiction, so there were a number of people who fascinated me and for whom there's a lot of material about one or another part of their life, but not really about the whole life. And so I decided that I couldn't use them. And they had to, you have to kind of fall in love with your people you're going to be spending years with, so they had to really appeal to you. So that's how I ended up with these people. So what I'm going to do is just take you quickly through all 6 slides and talk about them a bit, and then I would be happy to interact to your questions or comments. Oh, and I should say also that near the end of this process, I got to, I was very conscious of the fact that that these 6 lives were being mediated through one consciousness, through mine, through the writers. And I wanted to see all of them visually mediated through one consciousness. And my sister is an artist, her name is Gina Hersey, and she obliged me. So she created portraits of each of them. 4 of the 6 are based on life portraits, because for those 4 people, they had paintings done while they were alive. And 2 of them we don't know, so she made those up based on description. So I'll tell you about those. I'll tell you which ones those are. This is the first of them, and he was the first one who I chose, the first one that just grabbed me. George Sackville, he was born, later Lord George Germain. And every story needs a bad guy. He's a beautiful bad guy. He's not well known, but he ran the war for England. The Sackvilles were an ancient aristocratic family, and still are. And to give you a sense of what he grew up with, the house he grew up in is called Knowle, Knole, in southeast England. It's still there, and you can tour it. It was built as part of a fad among the very wealthy. It was called a calendar house. So it had 12 separate entrances, one to represent each month of the year. It had 52 interior staircases for each week. And it had 365 rooms. He was a teenager before he could wander at will without getting lost in the house. So that gives you a little sense of what he grew up with, the sense of entitlement, the sense of Britain's feudal might. And his father was a diplomat, and he went with him to Ireland to be educated, but then also he worked as his father's secretary. His father was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, who oversaw the administration of the British Empire in Ireland. And so from that, young George got his first-hand view of empire, and he had very fixed ideas about how you do things. His father was a very meek man. George was the opposite. He was combative, he was aggressive. He quickly saw that he didn't like the way his father was dealing with the Irish, who were kind of running circles around him. He also wanted to distinguish himself in the military. He became an officer. He rose quickly through the ranks. People began to talk about him as a leader and as a possible future prime minister. And then in 1759, everything came crashing down. He was in battle in a place called Minden, in what's now Germany. And this is in the 7 Years' War, which here was called the French and Indian War. And it's classic European warfare, and he was the second in command of the whole Allied side. And his job was to bring the cavalry in at the right moment. And so the order comes to charge, and he fails to carry it out. The second order comes, you have to charge now. He fails to. Finally, on the third order, he charges, but it was felt that the moment had been lost, and had he charged when he was supposed to, this decisive battle would have been truly decisive, and the French would have been forced to surrender, and the war would have been over. From that moment, his name was Mud. He was the most hated man in England. He was court-martialed. He was almost executed for treason. So he completely sinks to the bottom. He is, however, this inexorable personality. And he claws his way up from 1759, back up the rungs of power. And then in 1772, they give him the job of Under-Secretary of State for the American colonies, 1772. So he happens to be on what would become the hot seat in a couple of years. So he ends up running the war, and when he does, and this is the interesting thing for me, because as a writer, I try to kind of do what you can to get under the skin of the people. His enemies, the Whigs in Parliament, were very aware that he was carrying out this war in America with this very personal sense, this need to get redemption. And whenever his enemies in Parliament wanted to go to him, they would refer to him as the coward of Minden. So Minden never left him. And so it's an interesting personal element to the way the British fought the war. This is my second, and I'm introducing these more or less in the chronological order, the way they come into the book. And they don't, I don't treat them in the book this way. The stories are all woven together. And this is one of the portraits that Gina had to do based on descriptions, because we don't have a portrait of him from life. Grotier Furrow, he was born in Africa, in West Africa. In this country, he became Venture Smith. And he was probably a Fulani, member of the Fulani tribe. And so she found a Fulani 18th century mask, and that's the basis for the face, and then she put New England farm clothes on it. He was born in West Africa, and when he was about 10, he was the son of a local prince. And so his father was an important man. When he was about 10, his village was invaded by an invading African army. And he watched his father be tortured and killed. And he was captured and brought to the coast to a place called Anamabo, where they had still extant the ruins of the English slaving post there. And he was sold into slavery. And it happened that the ship that was in the harbor was from Newport, Rhode Island. It was called the Charming Susanna. So, and most of the 87 slaves who were bought at that moment were destined for Barbados, where life was very brutal and for most people short. But he lucked out in one respect. The ship's steward, a man named Robinson Mumford, wanted him for his own possession. So he bought him from the captain. And officers in those days would bring property of their own to trade, to barter. And they called that property that they were bringing their venture. So he named it Venture because he gave 4 pieces of calico cloth and a gallon of rum for him. So Venture finds himself working in a household first in Newport and then on Fisher's Island, which is in Long Island Sound off the coast of Connecticut. It's part of New York. And then in different places in Connecticut, mostly in Stonington, Connecticut. And what's interesting to me about him is through the 1750s and 1760s, he's an adult, and he begins working and saving money on the side to buy, hoping he can buy himself and his family, he had a wife and children, out of slavery. And he has several different owners, and he becomes a distinguished, impressive enough figure that for the last purchase, his last purchase, he chose who would buy it. So he met with a man named Oliver Smith, who was a prominent merchant in Stonington, and they agreed that if Smith bought him, he would eventually allow him to buy himself out of slavery. So, and what's interesting about it is he's doing this dogged working in the pre-dawn hours, fishing for eels and chopping wood to raise money to buy himself and his family out of slavery. At the same time that you have the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties and these milestones where white Americans are talking louder and louder about freedom. So he, you can read between the lines and say that he is assuming that this freedom is not going to apply to him. So he's got to take matters into his own hands. So he kind of is carrying on his own American Revolution alongside the wider one. This one is the one in the 6 who everybody knows. This is George Washington. This is based on the Charles Wilson Peale portrait, 1772. He's 40 years old here. Washington was the last of the 6 people I chose for the book, and maybe it was just too obvious. But then when I finally settled on him, he's the one that kind of fits them together because he interacts with nearly all of the others. When you are writing a book that covers a lot of ground, when you're in the middle of it, there's always moments of serendipity, moments where you see connections that you didn't know about, you couldn't have guessed from the beginning. And in addition to kind of these different people crossing paths with one another, there were a number of these things, these thematic connections that jumped out at me. And one concerned the notion of honor in the 18th century. George Washington is born in Tidewater, Virginia, and He is son of a planter, a tobacco planter, and he has certain expectations, and he's raised with a certain sense of honor and how you comport yourself. And it turns out that Venture Smith in West Africa, when he was Brotier Furo, the honor code that he was raised with was quite similar, and how he behaved because they had slavery where he was from in Africa, and how he behaved as a slave, he based on his sense of honor. There were certain things you did if you were on this side of that ledger, and a certain way you behaved, and if you were on the other side. And George Washington's life, I think, plays out very much along the lines of honor of Virginia planter. So and another connection, when he was about the same age, his father died. And Washington was raised with this expectation that, like his older brothers, his half-brothers, he would be sent to England to be educated and begin proper life of a gentleman planter. After his father died, there wasn't money. That was all off. He never got that. He always, after that, felt this sense when he was in the rooms with, Adams and Jefferson and Hamilton and all these people. He always felt this sense of inferiority, that he didn't measure up. He didn't speak French. He hadn't studied law. He came under the wing of the very prominent Fairfax family in Virginia, and that was really his ticket out and up. And he became, he was a total Anglophile and a member. He wanted nothing more than to be a member of the British Army. And if he had been made an officer, history might have been very different. But they wouldn't, because he was an American, so he had to stay with the Virginia militia. And it was while he was on a mission for the Virginia militia, as a Virginia militiaman, on behalf of the British, going from, as it happened, Fort Cumberland in Maryland, which is where I live now, in Cumberland, Maryland, to what they called the Forks of the Ohio, which became Pittsburgh, to tell the French who were there, this is English territory, you have to get out. Instead of doing that, he encountered a party of French soldiers and massacred them. And this was the event that the French had been looking for to start the French and Indian War, which became the 7 Years' War. So another funny parallel, George Washington's military blunder sets off the war that George Sackville's military blunder fails to end. And these two then would both rise to lead these two armies. They never met, but they would lead these two armies from across the ocean. I won't go with the rest of his story because you know. This is Tayet Boake. In English, he was known as Corn Planter. He was a Seneca leader. We have the notion of sort of the noble warrior, and he was that, but he's also this complex philosophical figure who I was really drawn to, and I was also really drawn to him because there's a lot of documentation, and a lot of documentation for him at a personal level. He could sort of see two sides things weren't black and white for him. And I think in a way that stems from the fact that his mother was a Seneca woman, an important Seneca woman. She was what's called a lineage matron. His father, however, was a kind of no-good white American from upstate New York who sometimes traded rum to the Iroquois. So he didn't stick around long. He was never a figure in his life. Corn Planter, as an adult, said that when he was a child, other boys in the village would make fun of him because his skin color was different. When he's older, he walks 300 miles to his father's town to meet him, to confront him face to face and say, why aren't you, in my life? Who are you anyway? So you get these real windows that is very rare. You don't normally get those kinds of insights into natives of the period. George Sackville, Lord George Germain, is carrying out the war for England. The British lose an entire army at Saratoga, 5,000 men. The Whigs in Parliament are calling him the coward of Minden. Why aren't you, running this war better? So Germain decides he's going to pull out all the stops. He's going to fight with, as he said, Roman severity. So he's going to, and one thing he decides to do is bring the Iroquois in on the the British side at all costs, and everybody was afraid of them because they were such violent warriors. So the Indian agents meet with them, and the Iroquois leaders are debating. Corn Planter counsels against it. He says this is a family quarrel. We're not part of that family. He's overruled. So he goes along with the majority, fights viciously, attacking American villages and forts. And in one of these, this is years after he had formerly met his father, through the smoke, he sees this old man, and he knows where he is. He knows the village, and he goes up to him, and he's captured him as prisoner now. And he says, "Don't you recognize me? You're my father. I'm your son." And gives this speech. This one, a woman who spoke English heard this, so we have this whole little dialogue where he's, or monologue, where he says, you know, I'm your son. I'm a warrior, and gives him, he wants him to be proud of him. So anyway, the British lose the war, which means the Iroquois lose the war, and then the Iroquois appoint Corn Planter to be the one to represent them, to negotiate with the new American government. And so he's in an impossible position. And he meets with them many times. He meets with George Washington twice during Washington's presidency. And by then, he actually meets with them the last day of Washington's second term. And by then, you know, by this point, the Americans are taking over the Indian lands, and they are basically forcing them to